I think a different spin could be put on this conversation. You may agree with me or you may strongly disagree with me, but hear me out. I'm touching on a very sensitive issue at the moment, but I think it's always good to look at things from a different angle. I have seen the debate of property funds buying up residential properties swell on social media over the last number of months. However, it's not quite as black and white as it's made out to be. People see it very much as the people versus foreign investment funds. But simply banning or restricting foreign investment funds will probably end up leading us in a worse situation than we are right now. To be open, in my past career, I have been involved with some REITs and some large funds, but not at the moment. I do advise some one or two large brands, but generally speaking, most of my clients at the moment are medium to small investors and sometimes first-time buyers. So I do have a perspective from all different angles. Owning a home should be an achievable goal for everyone, but I believe the narrative around REITs and investment funds needs to change. Funds buying homes or apartments does not remove those properties from the market. All it does is add them to the rental stock. In a lot of cases, these units are actually rented back to the council for social housing. So while they may deprive some first-time buyers from buying a house, they provide housing back into the rental market, and also a huge amount of these properties are being provided as social housing. Perhaps you might disagree with me on this point, but if you understand where I'm coming from, give this video a thumbs up, and if you haven't subscribed, please subscribe to the channel. It's important to remember that REITs are different than private property investment vehicles. REITs are listed on the stock exchange. To date, there's been 3 REITs created in Ireland: Green REIT, Hibernia REIT and IRES REIT. Green REIT is 100% commercial, and actually the asset values were higher than its listed stock exchange value, and it was sold out last year. Hibernia REIT is 90% commercial. They have about 309 apartments. All of those apartments were bought in 2015 when the REIT was set up as a larger portfolio acquisition. And as far as I'm aware, most of those apartments are currently let. IRES REIT is 99% residential. They have a handful of commercial units underneath some of their apartment blocks, and according to their last shareholders report back in February of 2020, they have 3,688 apartments and they have an occupancy rate of 98.4%. Most of IRES's portfolio was actually acquired probably between 2015 and 2018. Therefore, the listed REITs in Ireland have just over 4,000 properties between them and have a very high occupancy rate. When you compare that to Germany, where some funds have as much as 300,000 residential units and more, 4,000 is a very small number. Germany is a far different market than Ireland, and it's not quite right to compare the two. However, Germany has far lower home ownership percentages. Ireland has one of the highest home owner percentage in the world. And the reason I bring up Germany is because it's constantly brought out that Germany banned REITs buying residential properties. And that is true. They banned residential REITs buying properties for any new construction. I think that was back in about 2007. However, this doesn't stop REITs from building their own, and it doesn't stop them buying up apartments that were built pre-2007. It also doesn't stop non-REIT funds buying up residential properties. Ireland is a long way behind the rest of the world in terms of the percentage of units that are owned by commercial landlords. The majority of rental properties in Ireland are actually owned by small landlords who perhaps only have 1 or 2 properties. There are tax points that keep coming up, so I'm going to quickly address it, but I will skip over it reasonably quickly. REITs, generally speaking, don't have to pay a huge amount of tax, if any at all. However, they are required to pass out the rent that they collect in terms of dividend, and they have to pay out at least 50% of that. That means the owners, i.e. the shareholders of that REIT, are taxed on that dividend. And generally speaking, in most cases, they'll be taxed roughly around 33% on that dividend every single year. So it's a bit of a misnomer to say REITs aren't taxed. Technically speaking, the owners of those REITs are taxed. However, there are other property funds out there that are operating more like pension funds, and they probably aren't paying tax on the rent that they collect, and the rent is wound back up into the fund for reinvestment. But that's the same for you or me if we're putting money into our pension, it's not taxed until we bring it out, and you or I can invest in property via a pension and all the rent collected is not taxed. So that loophole that's there for these bigger funds is also there for you and me as well. You just have to know how to take advantage of it. So there are plenty of property funds out there, both international and Irish, that are buying up residential blocks and residential homes at the moment. That is the truth, that is the fact of the matter, and they've been doing it for years. This is a very important point to realise. Irish banks have not really been lending on development since the crash. International funds have really led the way in terms of providing funding for development in Ireland since roughly around 2013. They first started off lending in Dublin and then they grew out to other cities. But one of the main things, and a very important point to consider, was one of the key things lenders were looking for was an exit strategy for developers. Commercial lending for hotels, offices and student accommodation was quite easy to get lending because there was an exit strategy in place. Developers could pre-sell or pre-lease hotels, offices or student accommodation to operators or investors, and therefore the lenders knew that there was an exit strategy in place before they granted a loan for construction. Funding was also available for houses. Funding was generally granted in phases in line with the construction phases, and this is because houses could be delivered and constructed quickly, reducing any risk. Funding was very limited for apartment blocks because construction was timely, and also there was no clear exit strategy, which meant that there was increased risk. Also, in a lot of locations, the construction cost to deliver apartments actually outstripped the sale price, and therefore none of them were feasible. This all meant that traditional lenders were not willing to lend for apartment development. However, over time, due to the increased rental demand from tech workers, institutional investors were willing to pre-purchase apartment blocks for build to rent. This allowed developers to put agreements in place and get funding to develop their schemes. These build-to-rent schemes did grow in number. At the start, they focused in the city centre, but grew to good transport links like Dundrum and Dunleary, and even out as far as Santry. Over the last number of years, office yields have continued to compress, and the outlook for retail wasn't that promising. Therefore, investors all around the world started to look at residential blocks as a more viable long-term investment. This was happening all over the world, to every city. However, as Ireland had such an underdeveloped market for multifamily developments, a lot of people took a very keen interest in Ireland. Irish companies like Davies and Irish Life set up investment vehicles to go after residential blocks because they all forecasted strong growth in rental demand. The demand at the outset was very much on high rental areas such as the Docklands and locations that had good transport links. However, as time went by, particularly around 2019, when investors started to realise that the councils would sign 25-year leases to rent apartment blocks and offer them for social housing, investors started to look further afield. This drove investors to start looking outside the city centre, like places like Maynooth and elsewhere, for locations that they could find blocks or houses that they could rent back to the council. Government policy to lease these apartment blocks off private funds allowed these private funds to further their scope in terms of where they were looking, and this also had an impact on first-time buyers. In my mind, there is a fundamental flaw with the system if the government policy is to compete with the private market. The only end result is inflated house prices and first-time buyers are left out on the cold. The root cause of this is not the actual property funds. The root cause is government policy in terms of not building enough social housing, and government policy allowing to rent off private investment funds. The reason the government are doing this is so they can increase their social housing numbers rapidly and quickly, because it's far easier to grow those numbers by renting units than building them. But this is ultimately having an impact on the first-time buyers market. I really believe that government shouldn't be competing with the private market. Last year alone, councils rented over 20,000 units from the private market. There has also been a lot of negativity on social media aimed at Chinese buyers buying up Irish homes. I find this kind of concerning considering what's happening in the US, because there's a lot of hate speech towards the Asian community and actual physical attacks as well. But again, this is government policy that's facilitating this. The Irish visa program allows Chinese nationals gain an Irish visa if they invest over $1 million into social housing. Therefore, there is a market out there to group a few houses together of a total value of $1 million and rent them on long-term leases to the council or on HAP in order to facilitate that visa application. I do not think you can blame individuals or families who want to better their situation and get out of a communist state and have a life here in Ireland. And by doing so, they're investing over $1 million into social welfare housing. I really feel that this is an issue that you can't blame the Chinese for, and it's something that, if the root cause again, is down to government policy. Demand for rental accommodation is low in the city centre right now. However, we will have a rental crisis again in a few months once everyone comes back to work. Landlords are currently unwilling to lower their rents at the moment, mainly because of the rental caps that are in place. A reduction of $200 a month could end up reducing your overall property value as much as $30,000. Both large and small landlords are willing to hold properties vacant until people return to work because of the rental cap. In this case, the rental cap is actually having a negative impact for renters. One of the biggest issues international companies quote as to why they do not relocate to Ireland is the lack of rental accommodation for their staff. Given that fact alone, purely just that fact alone, that it's one of the #1 reasons why multinationals do not locate to Dublin, surely the state and surely Ireland should recognise that fact and incentivise these property funds to actually build more build-to-rent apartments, rather than actually trying to ban or restrict them. I know why they don't suggest this, because it won't win votes and the media will have a field day, but perhaps it is the better, more grown-up decision to actually take. One of the factors international funds will look at when they're deciding where to deploy their capital or what country they're going to deploy their capital in is political stability. If Ireland make a rash decision because 170 houses were bought by a fund, this will weaken Ireland from an international point of view, from attracting international funds into Ireland. And why would we damage our reputation right now in the crisis when we actually need more investment to build more? The government have actually locked down construction sites for months now. Every month that passes, it's costing developers probably thousands upon thousands on interest payments alone. I can't blame any developer who has taken the risk to build out housing, and the banks or their lenders might be putting pressure on them. And if they have an exit strategy through a fund, why would they not take it right now, considering how long construction sites have been locked down and the future in terms of the market is not certain? If they can lock in a deal that reduces their risk, why the hell wouldn't they right now? If the government decide to restrict how developers can actually exit schemes or developments that they're in, that will have an impact in terms of the risk, in terms of their exit risk, and ultimately lenders will be less willing to give funding for development. Rather than it being people versus property funds, why can't there be a win-win? Surely there's opportunities there. Why not try incentivize investment funds to build and buy and develop even more? What's wrong with saying, okay, we'll let you build more, we'll let you buy more on the basis that 20% of the stock is social affordable rents, or are let to civil servants, or are let to lower incomes, or even ask for more than that? Why not work with the funds? Incentivize them, offer them increased density or extra floors in return for X amount of apartments coming back for social rents, or 20% coming back for civil servants. There's a huge amount of ways that they can make it work for both the government and investment funds to make sure it's feasible. Get them to build more. If they want to put money in, get them to build more. Here's my main point. And I think this is how the story could be spun in a different way. If all of these investment funds want to invest in Ireland, why don't we welcome them in and get them to build what we actually need them to build? We need 400,000 units over the next 10 years. That's likely going to cost over 250 billion. Yes, over 250 billion. I'm not sure we want the state paying for that. I certainly don't want the Irish banks getting involved in that again. So why not allow these international funds to fund those developments? So if all of these funds want to invest in Ireland, and we clearly need more houses, why the hell would we stand in their way and put restrictions and caps on what they can do? Banning or capping anything will always lead to more problems down the line. The only real solution to this is to change our planning policy. However, that's going to take a long time and it won't win any votes short term, so therefore it's just not going to happen. But realistically, the only way to solve the Irish housing crisis is to redesign our planning and land use systems. Something that also should be looked at is the number of TDs and public as well that object to housing and turn around and complain that their kids can't afford a house. The only thing that all these objections for new schemes actually achieve is higher home prices for the bloomers and their kids never being able to afford a home. In summary, very little development would have taken place in Ireland in the last 10 years if it wasn't for international funding. Government policy around their inability to build social housing and their appetite to rent from the private market is a contributory factor to this discussion. Our planning system needs to be corrected if we ever want to solve the housing crisis. And if there is so much money wanting to get in and invest in Ireland, why would we stop them when we have a clear need for an investment in new developments? You can agree with me or disagree with me on some of these points or all of these points, but I hope I've shed a little bit of light onto this topic that is not quite as black and white as some people make it out to be. I think it's important to look for opportunities and not ban things. I hope you've liked this video. If you have, please give it a thumbs up. If you haven't subscribed to the channel and you are looking for more property insight, hit that subscribe button. And as always, I want to thank you for watching.